You're listening to Two Bobs, conversations on the art of creative entrepreneurship with David C. Baker and Blair Enns.
David, we tend to avoid timely issues. And before you insert a joke...
We're trying to not be super relevant, or what's the goal here?
The opposite of timely is not irrelevant. It is timeless.
Oh, okay. Well, you scared me for a minute. I'm on board now. Keep going.
Okay, but we're recording this on Friday, March 13th, Friday the 13th, 2020, at a time when the coronavirus or COVID-19 is kind of sweeping the planet. We're just starting to get a sense of how big it is here in North America. We didn't want to do a podcast on the coronavirus, but there is an issue coming out of this pandemic that is timeless, and that is, we're calling it right-sizing, when right-sizing makes sense and how to do it. Now, right-sizing is a euphemism for downsizing, correct?
Right. I don't know. It probably still feels the same if you get dismissed, whether you were right-sized or downsized, but I think it's a little bit friendlier term, supposedly.
Yeah, this isn't a friendly topic, but as you point out, this is why you, the listener, the owner of the firm, this is why you make the big bucks. These decisions that David's going to give you a framework to help you make, these are the decisions where you earn your pay and all the status and glory of being the person at the top of the firm.
Right. Before you cut your pay, before you dismiss people.
Cutting your pay does not absolve you of the responsibility to make the decision. Now, before we get into this, the principles and frameworks around right-sizing and when it makes sense to do so and how to do it, recently you hosted your own webinar on how to respond to COVID-19. And what was the response like to that?
Well, it blew me away. I mean, I have a Zoom account. I used to use GoToWebinar. I have a Zoom account that's automatically provisioned for 100 people. And I thought, well, we'll probably get more than that. So I raised it to 500, and then it just blew right through that in less than one business day. So we ended up having 852 principals of firms. So they were obviously very interested in that topic. And one of the things that I just touched on was the idea of how and when do you right-size staff? And you and I both thought, this is a topic we could dig in pretty deep here. And at the moment, obviously a lot of firms are considering it, but this is something that comes up in every firm's life at some point. And hopefully we'll be able to put together an episode that we can just point to and that would be helpful to people as they think about it.
Okay. So I think your first point is probably it would be great if you had made some sort of decisions in advance when you weren't in the heat of the battle, when you weren't feeling the stress of the moment. Is that correct?
Right, because there's too many things that are just pulling on you if you just wait until that very moment. So what you would do, and this could be caused by a downturn in your industry or by losing a big client or maybe losing your salesperson, or maybe it's more of an industry-wide thing, which has happened to us several times in the past, 2001, 2008, apparently 2020. And the idea is to have a plan A. So, hey, we need just a minor correction here, just a little bit, maybe 10, 15, 20%, something like that. And then a plan B, which is much deeper. And the idea is you just pull that out of the folder and dust it off, and it's easier to make changes rather than come up with something in the emotion of that moment. Because when I talk with people that have gone through this, and I went through this myself one time running an agency, and it was one of the most painful moments I had. I still remember, I remember crying during parts of it. You don't know, you're looking ahead and you can't see when the right time is. And that is mainly the most painful part of it, I would guess. And then you talk to people afterwards and say, hey, what was the timing like? Did you do it at the right time? And sometimes people will say, yes, I really did it at the right time. Other people will say, no, I waited too long. I've never had anybody tell me, no, I did it too early. So it's something worth thinking about. Even if you're not facing that situation right now, maybe you will in the future, I think.
I think a lot of agency principals and entrepreneurs in general tend to be pretty optimistic, right? So the reason behind that would be, well, we're optimistic that things are going to turn around, and then we wait a little bit too long. So this idea of having the plan in advance, a plan that you've made during the light of day, and we can talk about what would trigger certain things, like is it certain drop in revenue or number of clients, et cetera. But let's move on to the signs. What are the signs that it might be time to enact this plan?
Yeah, this is the most difficult. Like, when is it serious enough I need to go to the ER? that's sort of how you're thinking if it's from a personal health standpoint. But here for the business, let me just give you a couple guidelines that might help our listeners. One is if multiple clients, 2 or 3 clients, significant clients, begin delaying projects. That to me is the most worthwhile sign, because most firms don't have a client concentration issue. If you do have a client that represents a fair bit of your business, your billings, then that would also be another sign if there's some blip in that relationship. And usually the blip isn't terribly serious. It's just simply a delay because they're not quite ready to pull the plug yet, but they value the relationship they have with you. And they also need to explain why they're not getting you what they need or payment is delayed. And so they just explain this to you. And I think that's probably the safest way to look at this. Another sign might be just not seeing as far ahead as you normally do in terms of workload. And this varies by firm for sure. Digital firms that are building big projects can usually see 3-4 months out in front of them. Other firms that are on a really pure project-to-project basis, they're not going to see more than 8 weeks ahead of time. So just know whatever that is, when you think about managing your own capacity, and when that starts to drop, then that could be a sign, obviously. And then the most important one is when you look at your projections, so your fee projections. Let's say it's a $1.1 million firm, and 100,000 of that would be outside costs like freelancers or media buys or something like that. So then you would subtract that from the 1.1 and you're left with a $1 million firm in terms of fee. You could not, on a usual basis, safely spend more than 45% of that on unburdened comp. Unburdened means it doesn't include taxes, benefits, or bonuses. So if Tom makes 60 and Louise makes 60, then your unburdened comp between the two of them is 120. You have to include yourself in here. So when you look at what your fee projections are, you shouldn't be spending more than 45% of those on unburdened comp. So as your fees drop, but your unburdened comp stays the same, you know that when those lines begin to cross, they get closer together, then maybe it's time to think about what to do here. And at the beginning, you put the plans together, plan A, plan B. If it's later in the process and you pull one of those out of the folder and you say, all right, time to do something here.
So this is almost imagining a dashboard or at least a checklist. The first sign is multiple clients start delaying. Second is a blip in a guerrilla client relationship. And not everybody's going to have a guerrilla client, but most firms do, I think.
Right.
And then you lose visibility beyond 8 to 10 weeks out. And then this really vital metric, I think, and I've heard you say this before, but it just hit me how vital this is in this moment. You keep an eye on that unburdened compensation ratio. And then once it creeps above 45% of AGI, that's when the warning sign should start to flash. Is that correct?
Right. You can creep up to maybe 50%, but above that, every percentage point you're paying people is coming at a profit. And in a really difficult situation, you might say, all right, I'm okay doing this without making any profit for a short period of time, 3 months, 6 months, whatever. Then you might creep up to 55% or something like that. But anything above that, and the red light should be screaming in your head. I know red lights can't scream. I'll just correct that before you can jump on that for me. But it's time to be pretty nervous. And while it's true that a lot of firms don't have guerrilla clients, any client concentration problem, the ones who do have usually been growing really quickly. You will see a connection there. So any firm that's been growing really quickly almost certainly has been growing quickly on the back of one client. And that puts them at particular risk because they don't have their eggs in multiple baskets.
When you look at why businesses go out of business, it's usually a combination of two things. One is the kind of a prevalent, perhaps low-lying stress. And then the second thing is a shock. So you're under stress already. And this is how like human beings get sick too.
Right.
You're under stress and then there's this shock. And what's happening right now at the time of this recording is essentially a global shock. So those firms that were under stress are most vulnerable. So you want to pay attention. I imagine, just going back to that 45% of unburdened comp as a percentage of AGI, if some firm principals are doing the math now, they're going, well, I've never been at 40. I've always been above 45%. I've always been at like 50 or 52%. Is that appropriate to say? That might be a sign of kind of an existing stress already. Something's fundamentally but slightly amiss about the business.
In the language of health, we might say they have a suppressed
Yeah.
There's something wrong there already. They're old, they're infirmed, they have some complication, right? So they don't have the ability to bounce back like other firms do. If you think about a really healthy firm that doesn't have some sort of a deficiency in their immunization system, or however you want to think about that, they've got cash on hand, they have clients that are all relatively the right size, they have a marketing plan spinning up, they have a good culture. That's what drives my business. It's this hope that I can slowly help people make strong business decisions so that when shocks like this hit them, it doesn't take them out. Yeah, they may miss a couple of beats, but they're not out for good.
Okay. So when the shock does hit, you actually have a bunch of levers that you can throw. How do you decide which one to use? I'll use it as an example. So my wife is my business partner, and we've been kind of talking through this, basically this conversation, not so much on downsizing, but that does come up. Are we going to get to that? And there are a lot of levers we would throw before then. So we kind of hatched a plan. I said, okay, well, we've got lots of credit. It's just not as cheap credit as I'd like to have. So as a plan to prepare for worst case scenario, I'm going to see if I can get access to cheaper credit. So that's one example, but there's also payables, et cetera. So what's the list of what are the things that we might choose from, and how do we choose?
Yeah, and some of them are ones that you'd only want to live with temporarily, and others that you'd want to live with long term. One of them, like you said, is stretching out payables. I'm a little nervous about that in many cases, borrowing money. You might even stray outside of your positioning if you need to, and you probably would just assume that this is temporary, that it's not going to work long term, and you don't want to tell too many people about the fact that you're straying from your public positioning. But when it comes to making decisions around the people that you might dismiss, I can give our listeners some very specific tips here. And one of those is that last in, first out that you would find in a union setting absolutely does not apply. You should, as much as possible, just strip your mind of that. So you shouldn't be trying to protect the people that have worked there the longest, or somebody just bought a house, so we don't want to, you just got to be careful about that stuff. So that's the first one.
So hold on a second. I know we only have so much time, but can I just push back on that? I'm just unclear.
Sure.
Why is the most recent hire not the obvious one to let go first?
Because what does the business need moving forward? You're looking at, you've hired somebody because your business is trending in a direction. I was just talking with somebody right before you and I got on the phone. They're adding this new service offering that the marketplace is demanding from them, and this new person is going to do it, as an example. So that would mean that they're going to step back and keep doing the old things if they just keep the people that have been there the longest. So I just don't think it's relevant at all.
Yeah. Good answer. Okay.
The second thing, this is not intuitive. You want to protect the role players and then flex with the skill players. I'm using American football terminology here. The role players are the AMs and the PMs, account managers, project managers. Those are the people that you need to protect. Those are the ones that are more relevant to keeping clients and keeping them happy. And they're also very difficult, much more difficult to use on a freelance basis. So you would keep those people, protect those, and then you would flex, as in maybe dismiss or cut the hours of the skill players. So the coders, the writers, the designers, and so on, whatever your firm does. That would be the second and third ideas. The fourth idea is to not neglect the middle layer. And this is kind of what can happen if you don't think about it. So you're starting to build your firm. You've got 5-6 people, you're running it. That's not more than you can handle mentally. You decide that as you add more people, you need a middle management layer. And so now you're managing, as the leader, you're managing the middle layer, and the middle layer is managing the rest of the people. Well, you will get closer emotionally to the middle layer because those are the people that you interact with every day. And those are also the people who have made it easier for you to dismiss some of the things that you just don't enjoy doing anymore. They've helped free you up. And so it's natural to lay off the lower people who don't seem as important. But just like you built this pyramid up where you slowly added a middle layer, you do need to think about peeling off some of that middle layer as well. So that otherwise, if you don't do that, you'll end up with a very top-heavy organization with you, a pretty big middle layer, and then a whole lot of chiefs and not a lot of Indians. So it's just something else to think about.
So you politely say, don't neglect the middle layer. Or you mean when considering layoffs?
Right.
And another way to say it would be, you might start by looking at the middle layer. Is that correct?
Yeah, you might. And of course, the downside of that is that you are probably going to have to get your hands dirty again. It's all hands on deck. You're going to be operating like you were before some of these people came on board. And that's just one of the sacrifices that's necessary. There's a tough question that comes up when you think about who to include in this right sizing, and that's all the personal issues that come up. Here's an example. So I just hired Tom, and Tom was looking for a job, and Tom didn't have one. I gave him one. So if I dismiss Tom, then he's basically just looking for a job again. He didn't quit a job to come work for me, but Linda quit a job, and she might have even taken a pay cut to come work for me. So I feel worse about laying Linda off because she quit a job to come work for me. Or you think about, Susie bought a home with that new promotion I just gave her. That gave her the confidence to buy a house. I just can't quite. These are the issues that as a leader you do have to be aware of, but you almost have to ignore them. I mean, you've got to be sensitive to people and do whatever you can, but your job is primarily to do what's in the best interest of the firm, no matter how difficult that is. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes perfect sense. And I can just imagine how difficult some of those decisions are. But the way to think about it is, if the firm does not survive, how many people are you creating hardship for, as opposed to that one difficult conversation or that one difficult situation? Plus, as much as we know our teammates, we don't truly know about other opportunities that they may or may not have, or their ability to recover, whether they've got family support or somebody who's been trying to hire them for quite a while or whatever. We're just unaware of that. And I don't think we should take on the responsibility of having to make those guesses or decisions or do that math. Do what's right for the firm is what you're saying.
Yeah, and when you look back over your career, and I do the same over mine, when I lost those jobs, I fired myself at one job. I was a middle manager, and I just realized there's no way I can lay off these other people and not cut my own job. They were the best things that happened to me. And I don't want to pretend that that's always the case, because some people are unemployed for quite a while, or it's very disruptive for them. So it's not always true, but I would say most of the time it's a catalyst for a great change in somebody's life. That doesn't ease the pain, but it does mean that it's not quite as catastrophic as it feels like it might be. The other thing to think about is that you are presumably hiring really smart, really capable people that fit your culture. Those are the people that will struggle less to find new jobs. If you've done a really poor job hiring people, then dismissing those folks, yeah, they're going to struggle to find another job too, but that's why you shouldn't hire them.
You're listening to Two Bobs, conversations on the art of creative entrepreneurship. Your hosts are David C. Baker of Recourses, author, speaker, and advisor to owners of expert firms, and Blair Enns of Win Without Pitching, the sales training and coaching program for creative entrepreneurs. For more information, go to twobobs.com. If you find this podcast helpful, please help us by telling a friend and rating us on iTunes. Thank you. Now back to David and Blair.
Okay, we're talking about how to think about and make sense of right sizing, and then how to do it. We've just been talking about how to make some of the decisions. And then once you make the decisions, let's get into some of the specific tactics of how you go about these things.
Yeah. First one to think about is don't cut one person this week and then two people 2 weeks from now and then another one 3 weeks later. When you do that, people come to work and they just don't know when the next shoe will drop. I describe that crudely as don't chop somebody's leg off 1 inch at a time. Like, okay, I don't know how far the infection will get, so I'll just take 2 inches off. And then if that's not enough, then next week we'll take another inch off. That's just not the way to do it. Just cut as deep as you think you'll need to, trying to think ahead at least 2 months. If another round of cuts is necessary at that point, then they are. That's just part of life. But you don't want to leave people wondering every day if something bad is going to happen. So that's the first tip. The other is don't ever do it on a Friday. Don't ever do it in the afternoon. You want to be around so that the folks that are still on the team have a chance to talk with each other at work and they have a chance to talk with you if they want to. Otherwise, they'll be texting between themselves after work or on the weekend, and they might get unnecessarily riled up. There may be some misunderstanding because you can't step in and clarify things. So you always want to do this in the morning. People have more emotional ability to adapt to things in the morning when they're not as tired. So always do it in the morning and don't do it on a Friday as well. Be respectful, unless, like, I can't imagine a situation that would justify you escorting somebody to the door. I still see that happening sometimes. Now, if you're dismissing somebody for cause, then maybe that makes sense, but not in a situation like this. Just treat people with complete respect as much as you can. They're hurting anyway. Just let them hang around, but say, listen, hang around for a couple of hours if you need to. I want to make sure you have a chance to talk to anybody that you're close to here. And if you need to come back tomorrow, that's fine. If you need to use the equipment, just give them that respect. Treat them as if you would want to be treated.
Yeah, and tied up with respect is be empathic too, is what I'm hearing you say.
Right.
Okay. And then what about everybody taking a pay cut instead of having to lay off an individual or two?
Yeah, this question comes up quite often, and I think it's something that can work if the culture is really good. The problem with it is that a lot of folks that work for you don't have that flexibility in their budget. In other words, they don't have 10 or 15 or 20% extra every month, and if you cut that, they'll still be able to make it. So what you might be doing is creating a hardship for everybody, but it's possible, especially if you just dip into a cut with the middle layer and yourself. It is possible, but usually it makes more sense to make a tough call, especially if the culture can't withstand it. Usually, if that's a good idea, the staff will come to you and suggest it.
I heard a stat this morning on a podcast I was listening to. I'm not going to remember the bulk of it, but it was a significant percentage of American families do not have the capacity to take a $400 financial hit.
Right.
So the idea that, say you're paying somebody well, and let's say it's $100,000, which I think is still good money today, and you ask that everybody to take a 10% pay cut. I think the reality is there are some people out there who are kind of in that age or in that income bracket that might not be able to withstand without a significant hardship with the 10% pay cut. So there is something to think about, because you as the owner can withstand a 10% cut in your income or in your salary doesn't mean that your people can. So I can see how you'd have to think deeply about that.
Yeah. When we get more money, our needs and our wants tend to expand to take up that money, right? So
yeah. Okay, so you've made these decisions on who you're going to lay off, and you got some guidance, some parameters on how to do it, when to do it, etc. Are there some things that you can do to lessen the impact of the fall as these people are walking out the door? You've already alluded to some of them, like, hey, feel free to stick around and use the equipment, etc. But are there other things that we should be thinking about that we might do to help these people?
yeah, for sure. And of course, severance is going to come to people's mind immediately. And how much severance? I hear people talk about rules of thumb. The problem is that I hear very different rules of thumb. I hear 1 month for every 5 years. Sometimes I hear 1 week for every year. That's probably more typical, 1 week for every year. If the firm is suffering, then you don't usually have a whole lot of severance to dribble out. So I've encouraged people to use this mental trick. So let's say that things are getting fairly bad, but you're not ready to pull the trigger yet. So what you do is say, pick this date in your mind, say it's 6 weeks out, and then just recognize, so you could dismiss somebody right now and give them 6 weeks severance, or you could wait 2 more weeks and give them 4 weeks severance, and just use that mental trick in your mind so that whatever it adds up to, the number of weeks they're still with you plus the severance should equal the same thing. So every week you keep them longer is 1 less week of severance. And when you think about it that way, it's more humane to do it quicker rather than later, because they know that they're now looking for work and they have this thicker cushion. So that's one thing that I would definitely say.
I really like that idea. I think that's a great, as you call it, mental trick. In all but the situations where severance is spelled out in the contract, those situations aside, is severance at all a legal issue, or is it entirely at the discretion of the owner of the firm?
It depends on where our listeners are, right? In North America, it's a discretionary issue, but in many countries, pretty much over all of Latin America and a fair bit of Europe, it is mandated. And from what I remember, it's at least a month, and then it goes up from there. So you really don't have any choice. So the sooner you make that call, then the less time they'll be on payroll, but you'll still be on the hook for the severance.
Okay, so severance is one way we can lessen the impact. What about like offering follow-on work, freelance work, something like that? Does that make sense?
For sure, because often you may not need all of their efforts, but you might need some of them. And as a goodwill gesture, you could say, all right, I'm converting you now to a freelancer, but I also want to give you some work. So I'm going to guarantee you 30 hours the first week, 20 hours the second week, 10 hours the third week. So it's going to slowly fade out, but it lessens the impact. That's one thing you could do. If there's a client that your structure is such that you can't serve them profitably, but maybe a freelancer working from home could make money on them, especially if this person is connected to them closely already, it often makes perfect sense to let them take a client with you. It's a great solution for you, great solution for this person, and a great solution for the client.
So I've got to let you go, but feel free to choose any of one of our clients on your way out the door.
Probably not any of
Maybe
you.
not that way.
Yeah. Laptop, maybe an equipment that they're using that you don't need because you have a smaller staff. That's often a kind thing to do. And they probably have a personal laptop, but it's probably not capable of doing the high-level freelance work that maybe they're moving into. Health insurance, depending on the country again, talking more about the U.S., where a lot of our listeners are, that's a huge concern for them, especially if they're not married to somebody and they're on that person's health insurance. That's a big issue. So you could continue paying for that.
This is almost uniquely a U.S. issue.
Yeah.
It is a big issue, and I think many outside of the U.S. do not appreciate how significant an issue this is. The cost of private health insurance is significant.
Yeah. I think it hurts entrepreneurship significantly. There are a lot more people that being entrepreneurs if they could solve the health insurance issue for themselves. So, but at the moment, it's still an issue in the U.S.
Yep.
Let them use your facility. I'd be careful with this one because it's not really great long-term to have them hanging around. You can help find work for them. Definitely write them a glowing letter of recommendation. There are all kinds of things that you can do. I think beyond these things that we're talking about, being an empathetic human and just communicating that, being vulnerable, being helpful, struggling with them, I don't even know how to measure that, but it's certainly significant.
And I would add to that, just based on what you've already said, at the top of the list, be prepared. Be as prepared as you can. And you might be listening to this at a time when it's like, okay, well, the moment for preparedness is past. But the more of these decisions you can make in advance, and I particularly like your mental trick of saying, okay, 6 weeks out, so I can lay them off now and give them 6 weeks severance, or I can wait 2 weeks, etc. That kind of preparation about telling yourself and maybe even writing down when you're going to make what decisions. I think that's a big part of being empathic and aiding your people as best as you can. Okay, so let's talk about the last person or issue on the list is you, the principal. You could lay yourself off. Well, you can't lay yourself off. What can you do? What hits can you take personally? And what other things do you need to be thinking about?
If you've always wanted to buy this new car and you're ready to do it, maybe you still need to, but don't park it in the front. I remember I was working for somebody who was laying people off, and he drove to work that day and parked his red Corvette in the front. It was just a bad optics. Just all the little things. Just look at things through their eyes, through your team's eyes. That's important. I do think it makes a lot of sense to cut your own pay. I don't think it makes sense to cut it deeper than what the highest non-principal, in other words, the highest paid employee would make. I just don't think it makes sense. It relieves the pressure, and you should not relieve the pressure for the smart business decisions you need to make. That's another reason why it's not a good idea to leave a lot of money in your business, because then when something like this hits, you feel like you have all the time in the world and you don't react quickly enough. So that's an important one. I'd also just introduce the idea that open book management is something that people tend to warm up to when things are tougher at their firm. Don't do that just when things are tough. You might be more open bookish about your firm's struggles, but are you willing to maintain that when things get great again? So I just think a little bit carefully about that. I want to go back to something you said at the beginning that is so important. It's this notion, because it seems like as an industry, we're really poor at planning for these kinds of things. We don't want to plan for contingencies, and I don't know why it is. Is it because we're so incredibly hopeful and positive and think that we can sell our way out of things? I don't know what it is, but I just don't see many firms who are doing contingency planning like firms in other segments of the business world. I don't know why.
Might be a combination of optimism, creativity. I think optimism is a big part of creativity. And then an aversion to planning, which also goes with creativity.
Ah, that's it.
The high autonomy score, an ability to think on your feet.
Right.
And you might have that ability to think on your feet, and you might have that ability to think rationally on your feet, but it sure feels better when you make the plan when the chips aren't all on the table, and then you can reference the plan. You still might deviate a bit from the plan as, you're in the ring, you got a box, you got to make real life decisions in that moment. But it sure would be helpful in moments like this if you had thought about it ahead of time and you could pull out this list of things that you will and will not do, or in what order and at what point. And so you can look at the list and say, well, here's what rational me thought at the time.
Yeah.
Here's what irrational or maybe just emotional me is thinking right now. Let's at least find something that makes both of these people happy or less unhappy.
Yeah. I think what you just said about the creativity and thinking on our feet, that might have something to do with it too. But when you go through this, I went through this once when I owned an agency, and I remember the terror of it. And that terror has never left me. And I think it's really useful to remember that terror so that we don't get too far ahead of ourselves here, and remember that other side of growing too fast, or the other side of spending too much money, or not having a thick enough cushion, or allowing too big a client. Let's remember the flip side of risk sometimes, and at least be aware that it might hit us, that we're not immune to that.
Yeah, and I'll just say a final word to kind of our younger listeners who are maybe just a few years into managing their firm. I'm 53 now, and I've been saying recently, I feel like, the benefits of aging, I feel like I've seen everything twice, maybe 3 times. So as we're going through this economic downturn, the market's still continuing to crash, I'm looking at it and thinking, no, I've seen this before. I know how it ends. I know, it's just a sense of kind of calming that the world isn't ending. And I don't remember feeling that in 2009. 2009, I had kind of bravado in my business. It was essentially just me back then too. And I launched my business in early 2002, another down economic time. But there are opportunities in volatility. When you have to make these decisions, they're really difficult. And if your business survives, you'll go through this again. And you'll take more seriously the idea of the importance of planning. You'll learn some lessons, and then you'll go through it again. And maybe by the third time you go through it, you'll realize, okay, stay calm, work the plan. Everybody's going to be okay. One of my favorite lines is, everything always works out in the end. If it hasn't worked out, it isn't the end.
Yeah, that's a good reminder. The folks who weren't running a firm in 2008, 2009 are probably having a slightly different perspective of this than those that went through that.
Well, David, this is a good topic. On behalf of all of the creative industry, I know over the last couple of weeks and over the next few weeks, you're spending a lot of your time talking to large audiences remotely, like you did through your webinar, and you're addressing audiences of various industry associations, just trying to give them a sense of assurance and the tools like this on what to do when you have to do something. So thank you for all your good work, and thanks for a great conversation today.
Yep. Thank you, Blair.
Thank you for listening to Two Bobs with David C. Baker and Blair Enns. Subscribe and learn more at twobobs.com. That's the number 2, BOBS.com.